after that long, somewhat Christmassy introduction to this programme. What it's about really is explaining something that's pretty basic. It's about our grid, our energy grid. And in this video, I'm going to first of all talk about wind droughts. And wind droughts are just like water droughts in effect. You know, you have no water inflow in the rivers, low water inflow for a long time. And the same way you get wind droughts for a long time without hardly any wind. And wind turbines are extremely sensitive to wind. I mean, if you halve the wind on a wind turbine, you reduce its energy actually to 1/8. Yeah, so it's not proportional. Because the wind's half, you don't get half the power, you get 1/8 of the power. And so they're very sensitive to it. So when the wind drops for a long time, the wind energy disappears. So what do we have to rely on then? Well, we can't rely on solar because it's nighttime. So the solar farms are giving zero. The wind farms are giving nothing. What else is there? Well, you'll hear people talk of battery farms. You know, battery farms to bridge the gap. But they only last minutes or hours. Actually, the main purpose of battery farms is either to do tiny little adjustments to the electricity grid to keep it stable, or to store energy overnight when it's cheap and sell it the next day when it's expensive. That's it. But they're not long term. They can't cope with anything. We're talking about hours, even from all our planned battery farms. So battery farms do not even get near to approaching the problem with wind droughts, which go on for 18, 22 days. And the reason they don't build bigger ones is cost. Because to cover, say, a 20-day drought, wind drought, would cost in excess of £7 trillion. And you'd have to do that every 10 or 12 years. So how about pump storage? Surely that can come to the rescue. Well, I'm afraid no, it can't. All it is a very good system of storing energy. You pump water up from the lower level to the higher level. You'll lose about a quarter of your energy in doing this, but it's a good way to store energy. And of course, you know, we have things like Dinorwic, 9.1 gigawatt hours. But 9.1 gigawatt hours when we're looking for tens of thousands of gigawatt hours in a drought. So it comes nowhere near it. And even if we build more, it's as if it's nothing compared to the problem. So we can rule out completely using pump storage and batteries now. Such things just do not have the capacity to cope with any sort of wind drought past a few days. So what's the actual Miliband bonkers plan? Well, the plan is actually, after 2030, we build hydrogen storage in old underground mines and things and so on, and basins and so on. So we have all this underground energy storage, and we use the excess wind because we're trebling the wind. Now, if we don't use that, we're going to be paying twice as much immediately for already high-priced wind. It's a totally non-viable situation. So their idea is to use this extra wind power, even though the conversion costs a fortune. I've got a paper on this. It's here. And that paper actually shows that hydrogen, if you did it, would be 17 times more expensive than gas. So imagine your energy bill going up 17 times. It's totally out of the question. The economy wouldn't exist. Right, but that's what they plan on. And you know, and by the way, even that with the storage would only last a few days. It wouldn't last the wind drought. So basically, there is no storage. There's nothing viable, nothing. So how do we cover the situation for a high in the winter, say, when the demand is high? How do we cover it? And the answer is we use dispatchable energy. What's that? It's simply energy that you can turn on and say, I want this much tomorrow or now, and you'll get it. So gas does that. Coal does that. Nuclear does that. Actually, nuclear is there all the time. You can't just switch it on and off. Nor can you with coal, actually, but gas you can. You can follow the peaks throughout the day. So the effect of all this is that we have to turn to those dispatchable sources of energy to cover our situation. So what's the plan? Well, Ed Miliband's plan is, well, let's read it here. By the end of the decade, we must keep 40 gigawatts of spur generating capacity on standby for days when the wind and solar cannot keep the nation's lights on. What does it mean for days? Well, it may mean for 22 days of the wind drought, say, or 26 days like the 1952 wind drought. But in actual fact, the plan is to only use, of that 40, 35 gigawatts would be gas. And so you've got to keep 35 gigawatts of gas as a complete system. Put that into perspective. This January, on the 8th of January, we came within a sliver of a nationwide blackout, basically. On that day, we had about 41 gigawatts of demand. So 35, we've got to keep going all the time in gas, but only use it a tiny bit. So that's a complete duplicate system for about 90% of our demand at the moment is kept going all the time, and we have to pay for it. So we have to pay for all of this to do nothing. This is Walter Mitty land. This is Alice in Wonderland stuff, but that's just one of the issues, because of course, when you come to utilize that gas in emergency, it won't be quite ready. You can't leave machinery just sitting there all the time, as it were. And in fact, normally gas has to be running to come in and cope quickly. It has to be like in a standby mode, which uses 50% of its fuel anyway. So there's all sorts of issues here, but it's madness. It's madness to have all that duplicate costs. No one has costed all this in, by the way. That's how mad this world is. We are now truly in Alice in Wonderland world. I think that's the best world to consider we're in here. But it gets worse. Well, this is yet another one of my papers. And by the way, all these papers are linked to in the description below this video. So you can get reference to all three. This one looks at every year and how much dispatchable energy is going out of power and coming in between now and 2031. And it concludes that by 2031, we'll be facing between a 90 and 99% chance of a blackout. That's incredible, I know. But this is the madness we're heading into. And by all means, someone can read my paper and challenge it. By all means, challenge it. What I've done is taken it year by year to see what dispatchable energy we have available, including droughts for biofuel and including nuclear and so on. So that's what I've looked at to see what the total dispatchable is. And by the way, you'll find that in that conclusion there, we don't have even the 35 gigawatts of gas. And the reason is because of the maintenance and all the other sorts of problems we've got in that. And this is the third of my papers, How the UK is heading for blackouts with consequences almost beyond imagination. And that looks actually past 2030. It looked past there, and it also looks at their plans for higher and higher demand of electricity as we go from fossil fuels over to electric. And thank goodness their own incompetence means that we won't be doing that as fast as they have planned, but that's actually helpful in this. So we look at that as well. So there's a total of 3 papers if you want to go into detail on this and check out all my claims. And I certainly welcome people to do that, and I welcome criticism. I just want to explain something about what a blackout actually is, because it's not widely understood. It's not like the lights go off and a few hours later, a day later, they come on. No. A blackout that could happen with a tripping blackout throughout the country can take a week to come back. And that means everything. Your mobile phones are gone. They don't work. Your life support systems necessarily work, and we'll come to that in a second. Your petrol won't pump in the garage because electricity isn't there to pump it. Everything comes to a grinding halt. And that week is because all the stations can't just start themselves up because they need electricity to begin. So there's only some strategic stations. Norwich is one where the pump storage provide they hold so much back where they can start the process going and fire up the next station that then grow and fire up. That firing up process is about a week to get it all back. But it goes on 3 weeks or so after that, because in doing all this, lots of things will get broken. And so by the time the whole effect of the blackout is over, you're reasonably looking, and I'm being reasonable here, these aren't my figures, would be a month. So the devastation of that, we're talking about hundreds of billions of pounds. And hospitals are not isolated from this. Hospitals have 2 to 3 days of generator backup, and they won't even be able to get the fuel to them, because you won't be able to get fuel. And so it'd be a very good thing, by the way, if they had backup fuel for long term, like 20 odd days, but they don't. And so hospitals are connected to substations that serve the area. They're not isolated. You can't just say, I'm going to supply the hospital and nobody else. And so the deaths, well, the estimates of that I've done, I've used artificial intelligence to do that. It's not my work in this case. It's between 3,000 and 10,000 deaths overall in the country from such a blackout. And so you can imagine what the devastation would be. And if it happens in the winter without the heating and so on, because don't forget you need electricity to do things, even to get your normal heating going. So that's how devastating that can be. So I don't want people to think that what I'm talking about is a blackout for a few hours and things like that. I'm not. Okay? And when I did my water resource planning, we have to obviously ensure we had enough water in the reservoirs to see us through droughts, and we had enough capacity to absorb the floods and various other things. So we had to look at the supply we had. You're not going to believe this, but the wind industry has not looked at the wind drought situation. There's some very recent studies in the last few years, and I've been doing my own, which it's exactly the same as was done for water resources. Exactly the same. But in actual fact, the data's not there very well, because no one's really looked. It's amazing that an industry doesn't look at its fuel supply, in this case wind. And by the way, when people tell you that wind is free, it isn't. In the same way that wind is free, so it's coal free, and so is oil free, and everything else. It's using it that costs. So what this boils down to is this. We have to have emergency powers, as it were, when the madness of this government goes, no matter how it goes one way or the other. Probably through an economic crash it'll go, or maybe actually through a blackout that could also cause the government to fall. So when it goes, we've got to have a plan. I'm involved in a group working what we can do in Advance UK, but in the end it comes down to a very simple thing. We've got to get dispatchable energy into the grid as fast as we can. And with gas turbines now, I'm looking at an 8-year wait. There's a possibility of using old jet engines or from jet planes and redoing them, as it were, for gas. There's a possibility of that. But it seems to me the fastest route is going to be coal, because the steam turbines for the coal side are maybe 3 or 4 years. But we'd have to use emergency powers. And coal today is much cleaner than it was in the past. And so there are works that are coming. I'm doing work on that. But I think we're going to have to use coal, gas and nuclear. But for nuclear, we've got to get rid of all the red tape and all the regulations, which at long last today, I heard the Chancellor mention we've got to get rid of those. So it's taken years, but the penny's beginning to drop as we approach the crisis. But this government are totally incompetent. They're in truly, another land, a fairyland of logic, driven by an ideology, and I'm afraid you can't run a national electricity grid on ideology. We're having to build to a cost of 60 billion, well, 58 billion pounds to be more exact. We're having to build another grid to cope with those renewables. All that's going on your bill. Your bills are going to rise and rise and rise. Don't listen to any other rubbish. And all that's going on your bill. And we're going to be left with a terrible situation with so much wind and solar that we're going to be completely run out of money to feed it, because we're not going to be able to use it. The whole hydrogen idea is rubbish. We won't be able to do that, and we're going to have these huge excesses which we're going to pay for in constraint payments, whether we need it or not. Madness approaches. Now, in this video, I've tried to explain a whole number of things. I've left as normal now a lot of the detail in my 3 papers, which again anyone can read. I welcome the criticism, don't forget. Love to have proper discussions. I'd love to have a debate with someone on the other side on this, someone knowledgeable on the other side. I'd happily go for a public debate. I've invited the head of the climate party, actually, because I think his views are bonkers. So I'd welcome that. I don't know whether they'll accept my offer, but I've done that. And because so far I'm finding it very hard to get anyone to sit down and actually logically discuss things. If I could dream of things, if I had one of these things you polish and the genie comes out, and then my first wish would be in public to debate Ed Miliband. That would be good. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'm going to take this opportunity now, because it's getting to the end of November, to wish you all a very happy Christmas and New Year, and I thank I've got about 21,000 plus subscribers now. So I thank you all for subscribing, and I thank you for all the support I have. I have a Substack with all my papers in, so once you actually go to any one of my papers in the links below, you can get to see the rest, etc. And again, all these things are free. I don't charge anything anywhere for access to my work, because my work is completely about educating the public about what's going on. Thank you for watching. Happy Christmas and New Year.